ballot box has to, for hand count ballots, has to have a way to lock. It has to have a lid that can be locked, and it has to have an opening on the top that is only large enough to put a ballot in. It's not large enough for somebody to reach in and take ballots out. And generally, for hand count towns, the state issued wooden ballot boxes in the early 1900s, and some of the towns still have them. But they have a slide, they have a little opening that slides to expose the slot to put the ballot in, and then the person sitting at the ballot box will close the cover on the slot. Now with the tabulator, which we're not talking about now, but it's especially made to sit under the tabulator.
And so it's got to be locked, it's got to be big enough but not too big, just to get the ballot in, and it's got to have a slide so that after someone's voted, the slide gets closed.
That's right.
After each and every voter,
Yes.
that's a requirement as well.
And if the voter had more than one ballot, which in this case Long Island did not, they only have the state ballot, they were supposed to put each ballot in individually, and the slide gets opened and closed after each ballot is deposited.
So other than the ballot box itself and a polling booth or booths, what else is supposed to be behind
There has to be the table for the incoming voter list.
it?
And
Behind it. Is that-
and it can be part of the rail, but anyone who passes beyond that with their ballot are voters, or the other people there are the election officials, the warden, the work clerk, and the election clerk.
So from the real back, other than the person who's actually in the act of voting or an election official, is anybody else allowed back there?
You can have, if all your voting booths are filled, the law allows there to be 2 additional people waiting inside the guardrail who have their ballots and are waiting to get into a voting booth. So if there had been a busy time, during the day, did they, have a couple people waiting so that as soon as that voter goes out, the next one can go in.
What requirement, if any, law is there for observation of the ballot box during the day?
The ballot box and the booths have to be placed within the guardrails so that they're observable by any people watching from the outside. So you're not supposed to have a room that has any sort of anteroom with any of the materials. There is also an accessible voting system that has to be hooked up inside the guardrail, and it is a table of accessible height, and it has a phone and fax machine and a privacy screen, a 3-sided privacy screen, so that a voter with disabilities or anyone could listen to an audio ballot and have their ballot faxed back to them.
You mentioned that there's a slot and there's a cover for the slot, so someone needs to manipulate that, I guess?
That's right. There has to be a person, there's supposed, by law, it's supposed to be, one of the election clerks has to be at the ballot box
All the time?
all the time.
Okay.
Okay.
Senator Saviello.
Let me follow up on that. How is that slot secured after the election is over? You understand the ballot box being opened up. How is the slot itself secured?
There is no way to secure the slide, but before voting starts, before they announce the polls are open, the warden is supposed to open the ballot box to show that it is empty, and then lock the ballot box, and then either the warden or the worker clerk keeps the key. And for hand-count town, they shouldn't have to open that box all day until the end of the day when they're going to count the ballots.
Senator Ballot.
Follow up on that. Just a similar question. What prevents one of the clerks giving out the ballots from giving out more than one ballot?
There's nothing that prevents that other than the voter being aware and saying, look, there's 2 ballots stuck together, or them being careful to make sure they're only giving out 1 ballot at a time.
So at the end of the day, when I'm putting it into the ballot box, I'm only putting one at a time into that.
That's right.
Thank you. Do you know what the layout physically was in Wyoming?
I don't. I only know the location is at the same location as the town office. I don't know whether it's in a separate room from, the office or not.
So could you lead us through now, say John Smith's a resident of Long Island, and he shows up at the office to vote. Could you lead us through what happens from the moment he walks in until the moment he leaves?
day?
Yes.
So there can be, I do want to, if I can step back, there must be, in terms of election clerks, the minimum number of election officials you need to have at a polling place are 3 people. You must have a warden by law, and you must have 1 Democrat and 1 Republican election clerk during the entire time the polls are open, and after the polls close to count the ballots.
Doesn't have to be the same people. For
The election clerks do not have to be the same people, but they have to maintain at least 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. If they used more than 1 pair of election clerks, then they have to maintain the balance between the Democrats and Republicans, or no more than 1 additional. So if I had 5 election clerks working all day, I would have to have 3 and 2. I couldn't have 4 and 1 or 5 and 0.
Okay.
So as I say, if they only have 2 people, then 1 person is sitting at the check-in table, both checking the name off the list and handing out the ballots, while the other person is sitting at the ballot box. The warden and the deputy warden should not be filling those roles. Their roles are to supervise, to make sure there's no activity. They shouldn't even be spelling people for breaks. They should have, additional Democrat and Republican to come in if you're going to send somebody for a lunch break, or some towns have people work a shift during the day and they have another set come in. So that would be a good question for the clerk as to what people worked. Did they all work all day and count ballots as well?
Thank you.
So when the voter comes in, they come up to the incoming table and they're required to state their name. We recommend that they have a sign that says state your name, or the election official. That's to prompt them to state their name, even if they know the person forever. The whole purpose is for poll watchers. Even if there aren't any, it's just to maintain that process so there's transparency. So if I walk up to the table, I say Julie Flynn. The person looks through the incoming voter list. They usually have it tabbed with alphabetic characters so that they can go to that part of the list. They find my name on the list and they make a mark. It can be a check mark or a line. There is a column with a little box to the left of the voter's name where the AB gets pre-printed if they voted by absentee ballot, and that's also a place where either a check mark or a line can be placed. We have a lot of towns we don't require them to do the check mark because some people make check marks so large that they spill over into the one above it or below it. So, and it appears, my recollection of Long Island when we looked at the list was they made just a horizontal line in the box to denote people who had voted at the polls, as well as they made a line above the AB for those absentee ballots.
Any particular color ink they're supposed to use?
They are supposed to use red ink only within the guardrail for, they are supposed to have either pens without, pencils without erasers, or pens for the voters to mark the ballots, but for the election officials, they're only supposed to use red ink to fill out all their forms and to check off the incoming list.
Okay, so Julie Flynn has come and announced her name, has been checked off. What happens then?
They have their stack of ballots. We recommend, although the law doesn't specify this, but they have to cancel all the loose ballots out that are unused at the end of the day with a big X or a red mark line through it. So we recommend they only open 1 package at a time and use that package, so that they have no more than 50 ballots that are there on the table at any one time.
Right.
Senator.
That's one of my questions. So there is a possibility somebody could open all 200 ballots that day, or 100, 150, whatever.
Right, that is not what we recommend, but, and part of the reason for that is logistical. They're going to have to cancel those all out at the end of the day. That's part of the security of those ballots.
Thank you. Senator Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the 3 people minimum. 1 from each party and a clerk minimum, correct?
The warden, yeah.
And the warden and the clerk is the same person. So does that person become one of the three?
Yes,
So am I to understand that one of the major party people is checking people off, giving them a ballot?
yes.
The other person is doing what? The other major party person?
Sitting at the ballot box.
And then the third person, if there are only three?
The warden is the person just making sure
So
that,
it could be just one D, one R, and then one observer?
or the
It-
warden,
it-
right,
it-
who's in
it-
charge.
Right. Okay.
That's right.
All right.
Okay, thank you. So first, you take your ballot, go back into one of those booths. Assuming you don't need any assistance, you make the checks, you exit the booth, and then what happens?
You bring it over, you bring your ballot over to the ballot box. The person sitting at the ballot box opens the slide, you deposit your ballot, close the slide, you exit the guardrail, and you're done.
And this same process goes on through the day. Is the clerk or the warden supposed to keep any record of who's working when during the course of the day?
There is supposed to be a list posted of the people who were appointed to work. It doesn't have to be like who was scheduled what times, but there should be a list outside the guardrail of the election clerks that were appointed to work.
If Susie Smith goes to lunch, excuse me, from 1 to 2, there's no record of when, who went left.
No.
came back.
There isn't. I did want to mention one point of the chain of custody is on election morning, the clerk brings the election day ballots, the box of ballots that they had opened when they received them and then resealed them, brings them to the polls, and they have a warden's receipt. So the left side of the warden's receipt, the clerk has filled out identical to what she gave us on our receipt to say how many ballots she received for election day. And the warden is to look at the ballots and say, yes, I got 3 packages of ballots, and fill out the right side of the sheet. Unfortunately, that receipt, we don't require it to be sent to the Secretary of State. And that may be something we want to do in the future, but that is something that the town is supposed to keep in their records for 2 years after the election. So it shows the transfer of the ballots from the clerk to the warden. Now, in this case, because the clerk and the warden are the same person, it's not in law, but we recommend, if it's possible, to have a deputy warden to, if the clerk signs off on the ballots that came into her office, then have a second person sign off acknowledging that the ballots were received on election day. Now, in a small town, in a Glenwood plantation with 5 total voters, they're not going to have a second person. They have a clerk, and the clerk is the warden, and there's no one else to sign. But we do recommend, if possible, to have a second signature as a check and balance.
So we go, by the way, do you know what time the polls did open?
I don't know.
So we go through the course of the day, and let's just go back to the absentee ballots for a moment. Do you know if any of those, I understand there is a provision in the law for those absentee ballots to be counted, not, at least to be placed in the box before 8 o'clock at night, is that right?
That's right. They would have had to post that on their notice of election. There were some towns who processed the day before election day. I don't believe, and I don't think we checked this, but I don't believe Long Island is, mostly tabulator towns that have hundreds or thousands of ballots. So if they were going to process during the day on election day, they would have had to post the specific times on their notice of election, and they would only be able to process at those times.
Okay, let's assume for a moment that they did not do that. So those absentee ballots and their envelopes would still be intact at 8 o'clock at night?
Yes, and then they would have to open and process them at 8 o'clock.
So now we're at 8 o'clock at night. Whoever's, by the way, do we know if there are any new registrations the day of the election going on?
I believe there were, because the voting list has people whose names were added to the list. I believe there were some added. I'm hoping I'm not remembering that incorrectly, but you will be able to see that on the voter list. The registrations themselves would not get sealed with the incoming voter list. They would go back to the clerk's office to be put into the system.
We'll take a look at it. It's your recollection that the voting list does have names.
I thought there were some names added, and I apologize if I'm thinking of another town, but
So it's now 8 o'clock at night, the absentee ballots are still in that box, and where is that box, by the way? It's secured?
it should be secured. I mean, if the clerk is the warden, then the clerk probably brought the ballots with her as, and they're sitting at a table inside the guardrail. I mean, sometimes the warden will have a table. If there's a larger community, they've got a lot more, they've got cartons of ballots that are yet unopened, those would be on the warden's table. So there'd be a place inside the guardrail where the paperwork, the warden would have the tally sheets for later, the return votes cast, all of the forms and things.
Okay, so it's now 8 o'clock, anybody who's in the voting area can still vote, and then the polls closes for they close at 8 o'clock.
That's right. The warden will announce that the polls are closed. If there's a line, they have to station somebody at the end of that line. Everybody who's in line to register to vote, and then to vote gets to finish that process even if it's after 8 o'clock. I'm not aware that there was anyone in line late, so.
So it's now 8 o'clock, the polls are closed, the clerk has announced that, or the warden has announced it. What happens next?
Well, if there are any absentee ballots that haven't been processed, the warden and an election clerk would review the envelopes, review the notes of the clerk on the envelopes, and would read the name of the voter. The other person would look through the voter list to find that name, would mark or note that there was an AB there, and then they would open the envelope. There's no one there to challenge it, and the ballot's put in the ballot box. So all the ballots must be opened and put into the ballot box before they begin the counting process.
Do you know if in this particular case there were challenges to any absentee ballots?
I do not believe there were any challenges on my end at all.
So now the ballot box is full of ballots from people who voted that day, plus the absentees.
That's right.
It's still locked.
That's right.
Okay, then,
They should be setting up.
excuse me, pardon me, Senator
I
Saviello.
want to go back to 1 second, back to the 250 ballots you said. They couldn't open all of those before the election, as you said. Who keeps, do I have them as, when you come into my town, they hand me a ballot? Do they have all of them there, or do they have, how are they allocated out?
They could have, but I mean, even in a small town, I mean, I would probably have 2 packages over on the warden's table and have just 1 open package at the incoming table.
So that's a good question to ask.
That's right.
Okay, so all the ballots are now in the box, which is still locked. And by the way, I take it, is this all now still behind the rail?
That's right.
Okay, and no one, am I correct that no one other than the election officials at that point are allowed back here?
That's right. That's right. People can be outside the guardrails, so the polls are closed, but you can't close the building. You have to allow people to be outside the guardrail to observe the count.
What happens?
And they should be setting up their counting tables inside the guardrail. And they should have an empty table where they open the ballot box and they remove all the ballots. They make sure they have all the ballots out of the ballot box, and they put the ballot box aside. And then they start making sure the ballots are unfolded. The recommended way is to make sure they're with the candidate side facing up, because the referendum are on the back. So they're gonna put the candidate side facing up and count them out into what we call lots of 50. So they should have, counted them out into 3 lots of 50, plus if there were 92, an odd lot of 42.
Okay, and who's do the counting? Any of those folks potentially?
The election clerks specifically must do that, and they should be doing it in a team with 1 Democrat and 1 Republican.
But the election clerk himself or herself is the only one who's supposed to count those lots of 50?
That's right. The warden can be watching it, and just making sure everything's getting done correctly, but it should be those Democrat and Republican election clerks. I mean, they did have a person listed as an election clerk who was unenrolled. If they had 2 teams of counters, as long as they had 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, they could pair the unenrolled with a Democrat or Republican, but I don't honestly know if they had 1 team or 2 teams. teams
I'm sorry, I guess
for counting.
maybe I'm the only one who's confused here, but who's the person or the people who count up those lots of
Those
votes?
are the election clerks.
The
They
election
should
clerks,
be,
and
they should be sorting the ballots, putting them into 50s, and then one lot that will be fewer than 50, if there's an odd lot left over, and then getting them ready to tally.
And again, nobody but the election officials are back behind the wheel
That's right.
participating in this, and this is done in the full view of the public, if there is anybody
That's right.
there to watch. Okay. All right, so they're divided into lots of, Senator Cushing? Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regards to the lots, we had a discussion earlier about how they're packaged at the printers and then delivered, and your receipts verify what is assumed by the packages that are there. Are you at some point going to address the number of ballots that were cast and the other election results? Or is that something we might want to ask a question about? Yep. In regards to the total number of ballots that were cast, either as absentee ballots or walk-in ballots on election day, do you have from the process the total that was tabulated, blanks, cast ballots, and then the ballots that were unused, and how were they identified and tabulated?
Okay. We provide the town with tally sheets.
Can I ask you a excellent question, Senator? Can I ask you just a whole question? Because I think it's going to come chronologically in just a second. So we know that in this particular case, theoretically, 4 piles, 3 piles of, there'll be a number of piles of 50, and then there'll be a pile of might be 50, but probably something less.
Right.
Okay. In this particular case, I guess there were 4 piles apparently?
Yes,
And
there
then-
were 4 lots.
4 lots, excuse me. And then what happens now that they've been divided into these 4 lots? What's supposed to happen?
If there's only one team, 2 people counting,
We don't know in this
and we
particular.
don't know that. If there is only one team, they're going to, we recommend that there's a place for a lot number on the tally sheet. And like we do at the recount, we recommend that each team be given a letter designation. So if there were 2 teams, there should have been a Team A and a Team B, is what we recommend. And then the lots would be consecutively numbered for each team. Yes. This is the Long Island tally sheet that we provided to them prior to the election, and there's a ballot lot number, and the total ballots counted in the lot, and there's a place for the 2 election clerks to sign off when they're done counting.
And this is a sheet for each of the lots of 50.
That's right. And they actually do it in 2s. So we want the ballots, we want there to be 2 identical tally sheets filled out for each lot. And over the years, we're required by law to provide them with a uniform method of counting ballots. We used to allow more than one method that they could use, but now, in the last few years, we have required only one method, which is if there are 2 counters, the lot of ballots is put between the 2 counters, and each counter has their own blank tally sheet. So they know there's 50 in this lot, they record that, they record the lot number, Team A-1, that's the first lot I'm counting, and they go through and do a concurrent count of every race. So they would say, U.S. Senator, okay, that's a vote for Flynn, I'm going to mark one for Flynn here. And then, Governor, okay, that's a vote for Packard, we're marking a vote. So they're each maintaining their own tally sheet. Going down in the column, the top of the column, there's for tally in 5, so 4 vertical marks with 1 diagonal mark to signify 5, 1 set of 5 in each box. And then at the end of counting the 50, you carry across your lots of 5 and come up with a total vote for that 50 for each candidate.
Senator Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one, so are they analyzing each ballot for every race at one time.
That's right.
That ballot is only reviewed one time.
That's right. It's reviewed one time by two different people, and they're each maintaining their own count. But the way this concurrent count is intended to work is so that it used to be they could make their own tally and then they could compare it later, and if there were errors, they'd have to go back and recheck. But this way, they're agreeing to what the count is and then marking it on their own tally sheet, and at the end, they compare their tally sheets and make sure they agree, and if they agree, they're going to each sign both tally sheets. And one tally sheet gets wrapped around, the ballots get refolded, and they wrap the tally sheet around and secure it with a rubber band. The other tally sheet goes to the warden, who has a warden's tally, where they record the totals for each lot, or they're supposed to. And only if there's, in a town like Glenwood Plantation with 5 voters, there's only one lot of ballots, they don't have to do a warden's tally, because there's one set of totals on that individual tally sheet. They can put that right on the return, but if there's more than one, there's a column for each lot. So they were showing them A1, and that's all their totals would go in the column. And then the warden would add up those 4, in this case, those 4 lot totals, and get their total result for each office, which they would then put on the return of votes cast. It's a paper form. Again, when we provide them, it's specific to their candidates and offices. And the warden, if the warden has a deputy warden, they should be checking the warden's totals on the warden's tally to make sure there's a check and balance there. That they're checking that, and they're signing off on the warden's tally and on the return of votes cast.
Thank you. Senator Cushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regards to the 2 tally sheets, one is wrapped around a lot of ballots, as you indicated. The second goes to the warden or deputy warden that is tallying the total results from the different lots. What then happens with the second tally sheet that is submitted to
The second tally sheet should go back to the clerk's office with the warden's tally and the return of votes cast. And that gives the clerk an opportunity the day after election day to verify that there hasn't been a counting error or math error on the forms, which they can correct. So the lots of 50 that have the tally sheet wrapped around them are sealed in the tamper-proof containers.
We'll get that in a second. So again, just to follow up on Senator Cushing's question. 2 tally sheets, one gets wrapped around a lot of 50, the other one goes to the
To the warden,
To the warden.
to total up, and then ultimately back to the clerk.
And there's a separate form for the warden to fill out. It's basically adding up the various tally sheets, I guess.
That's right.
Okay. And that sheet, what happens to that sheet? The warden does that.
They should be making a copy if they have the ability to. They should be filling it out in duplicates so that one should get sealed in the blue box and one goes back to the clerk. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes there are only copies in the blue box and not sent back to the clerk.
So the original goes with the 4 packets and the tally sheets around.
That's right.
Okay. So the Senator Cushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do the election wardens or the election clerks sign any of these tally sheets, or are they void of any distinguishing identification?
The individual lot tallies are signed by the 2 people that count them. You know, let's see. There's a place for each, the 2 people that counted that lot to sign. The warden's tally, I think, also has a place for the warden to sign. There isn't a place for a counter signature, but we would recommend if, even if she didn't have a deputy warden, I would ask an election clerk to just check my math so that, you have everything done in 2s. It's a good idea to have somebody else to check your work.
And ideally, the numbers that of all the 4 tally sheets should be the same as the combination on the warden sheet.
It should be.
Any reason it wouldn't be unless there were a statement?
What has happened in the past is that someone has forgotten to record a lot tally on the warden's tally sheet, or has reported a lot twice. We've seen that in recounts. As a matter of fact, in the Senate District 11 recount this year in the town of Prospect, we found a lot of 50 ballots that had the outer signature page, 2 copies of the signature page for a lot tally, but had no tally wrapped around it. And that tally was not added into the totals. So we have no explanation for why that happened, but it didn't change the outcome of the elections, so we counted them in at the recount, and that changed their result, or it changed the margin of the result for that race. And then we had the town go back afterwards and count that lot of 50 for all the rest of the races to correct their return before they submitted it.
Thank you. Senator Cushing?
I don't want to belabor this, and I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if this is going to be available to discuss recount questions that might come up after we've had a chance to talk to some of the elections.
Absolutely.
I think we may ask her to lay out the law that we expect.
I guess I'd like to reserve a couple of questions related to that, but just since you brought it up and it is relevant to this issue, the ballots related to the District 9 election were properly sealed in the elections, security boxes, the ballot boxes like what is on the table next to you.
Yes, and I was going to show, this is an empty box actually, and show you how those get sealed at the end of the day.
So now, in the case of Long Island, so we had tally sheets wrapped around the packs of 50 and one pack that's less than 50. And we've had a completed warden certificate. And those things are supposed to now go into a box.
Yes. These are tamper-proof containers provided by the state in 93 or early 94 as a result of the Electoral Commission in 93. The state,
It's a courtesy of Secretary of State Diamond.
that's right, that's right. I was in Portland when I got my 120 boxes. So these are, we've essentially bought more over the years to provide them if they needed them, but they have a latch.
This is identical, not the Long Island box, right? Identical.
Yeah, that's identical. Long Island box is over there, but we have extras in our office, and we use this for training, actually. This is for somewhere plantation. This is our training materials. We also provided, we purchased, the predecessor purchased these locks. They are best locks, but they are, we have a series that is reserved to the state of Maine for the number on the core, on the bottom. So we haven't run out of them yet, but we issued every town a padlock and to go with each container, and they got one key to open the padlock. Before each election, we send them a specially numbered seal. I just want to put that under there. It's a wire and plastic seal. It has a unique number on it. And we provide them to each town before each election. And this is affixed, take it back, to the latch hole, put through the latch hole before the lock is put on. You have to be careful because it's entirely possible to put your seal in your lock but not have the lock attached. So it's important that they make sure they've got everything in there and they snap the latch in, and then the lock hole is not big enough to put the lock in first and then try to fit the seal around it. You have to put this in first. There's an opening. You can see that's not closed, and it's possible if you only close it a little ways that if you tug on it and it opens, it's not in far enough. They should be checking that. In this case, I went a little too far with this lock. and I'm gonna have to use my wire snips to open it. But then the lock is applied and locked. And there is a certification of sealed ballot container that they fill out for each lock. So this one is for Long Island. It has the date of the election. It has the voting district. There's only one. It has the container number, if they use the container number. The lock number from the bottom of the lock. And the seal number that was on the box, signed by the clerk in this case, and the deputy warden, the warden rather, and the deputy warden. And it's dated, and the time that's on there is 11:10 p.m. on November 4th. They are supposed to fill this out with the time that they're locking the box, and they're supposed to, we don't know if that happened, but that's the time that was indicated, and that the box was locked, and that the seal, you know.
Okay. If I could, just a couple quick questions. So again, can you just clarify for us exactly what was supposed to be in the box?
Any voted ballots, so the ones that have been counted by hand in their lots of 50 with the tally sheets wrapped around. If they have a spoiled ballot, the voter made a mistake, they came back and asked the warden for a new ballot, there's an envelope, we provide them with a label to put on an envelope, and they would put the spoiled ballot. This year we supplied them with a stamp that said spoiled by voter, replacement ballot issued, and a place for the warden to sign. So there could be spoiled ballots segregated in there. There should not be any unvoted materials, no absentee materials. There should not be, the incoming voting list should not go in here. So those should be in separate packages.
So the packets of voted ballots and the spoiled ballots. Any spoiled ballots in this particular case, you know?
I don't recall seeing them in there, no.
And just quickly, if I could, the lock and the seal, you mentioned that the clerk has a key to the lock.
That's right.